Welcome back to Hangin at the Reef. I'm your host, Jeffrey Rich, and today we're diving into an extremely complex topic, religious nationalism, with a focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Religious nationalism has shaped conflicts worldwide, and few are as deeply intertwined with historical and theological claims as the ongoing struggle between Israel and Palestine. To help us navigate this intricate landscape, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Margot Kitts, a distinguished professor at Hawaii Pacific University. Dr. Kitts coordinates the programs in religious studies and East-West classical studies and holds a PhD from the Joint Doctoral Program in Ancient Near Eastern Religions at UC Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union. Dr. Kitts is a prolific author and editor, having published 12 books and over 50 articles on topics including religious conflict, ritual studies, and ancient studies. Her notable works include Cambridge Companion to Religion and War, Sacrifice, Themes, Theories, and Controversies, and Martyrdom, Self-Sacrifice and Self-Immolation, Religious Perspectives on Suicide. She also serves as the editor of the Journal of Religion and Violence. Her academic journey and contributions have significantly impacted the fields of religious studies and ancient history, making her a respected figure in her discipline. And her expertise in ancient religious traditions and their modern implications will provide valuable insight into today's discussion. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Margot Kitts.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
So before we dive in, could you define what religious nationalism is and share a bit about your research and how your work intersects with this topic?
Gosh, religious nationalism, in the contemporary scene, we tend to date it to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, but you could really look much further. You could go down to the Crusades, you can go down to different popes. It could get very complicated. But I think the Iranian Revolution really aroused the attention of all the scholars because it was so explicitly theocratic and a rejection of everything that I guess up until then we thought was realistic. You know, we had rationalism, we had democracy, we had the liberal order. And suddenly, you know, the Iranian clerics just threw that out. And of course, it subsequently inflamed conflicts everywhere. So we have conflicts in India, for instance, as well as here in the Middle East. But it is true, in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it's unmistakable.
Well, so many of these conflicts seem, to have been exacerbated or have their roots in colonialism. So much of the religious nationalism seems rooted in colonialism and some of the legacy that exists from that era. Can you talk a bit about the Iranian Revolution and the U.S.'s influence over that country and what happened to lead it to its current state?
Yeah, it was explicitly a rejection of the U.S. I mean, and likewise with some of these other these other places. But the U.S.'s sticky fingers were involved with the Shah of Iran, and they wanted none of it. According to Mark Juergensmeyer, when this started happening, he has this big book on religious nationalism. When this started happening, it was startling because it was, an embrace of the kind of ethnic nationalism and religious ideology as opposed to everything that the West had assumed was right since the Enlightenment. So it is very complicated, and people are so zealous about it, or some are. Of course, not everybody's like this. We mustn't think that people have one focus in Iran or in the Middle East, the broader Middle East.
Well, so many of the regions have different dynamics at play. We just talked about a bit of what's happening in Iran and the emphasis on fundamentalist beliefs and a government that's based obviously in theology. You've got the Iraq War in a more contemporary setting, and the U.S.'s impact on that country. But the one that has endured and seems to be at the heart of so much of this conflict is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So for our listeners, let's take a step back. I know that, young people, for example, look today at that conflict and view it in a more contemporary framework. And I know many young people tend to have sympathies towards the Palestinians, for example, because of the perception of genocide and ethnic cleansing that they perceive to be happening in that region. But this is a long history of conflict that dates back well over 3,000 years, with culpability on both sides to some degree. But can you take our listeners back maybe to the origins of this conflict and help them understand why this is such a hotbed of religious nationalism?
So, good question. Almost impossible to summarize in a few minutes. But of course, it is true that first we should know the religious nationalists, like in religious Zionists, for instance, in Israel, comprise only 10% of the population. But in the military, it's 20%. And among the leaders of the military, it's like 2-1. And of course, they have an outsized influence on Netanyahu and what the government is doing right now. So, but it is important to know that that Israel itself, Israeli society, is really a complicated mosaic. It has atheists, it has Christians, it has Muslims, it has Jews of all derivations, it has Hindus. You can look up a demographic chart and see all that. So, but it is true that the religious nationalists really control the dialogue here. So if we were going to start in the Israeli conflict, I mean, the extremists will go back to Genesis 15, where Abraham was given the land of not just what is now Israel, but everything between the Nile River to the Euphrates. Can you imagine? And you hear this in chants from the Palestinian side right now, too. But of course, he lost that because everybody they left the promised land for Egypt, and they spent 470 years before they got back, with the whole Moses story. And then the scene is just so complicated. So Israel eventually divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians in 722. The southern kingdom in 586 was nixed by the Babylonians. No more promised land, ever. They did come back 50 years later, but they didn't have control of the land until, of course, and then the Romans came in around 70 CE and just booted them out. They not only burned the temple, but they salted the area around it so nothing would ever grow there. Then in 132, they did a kind of cleanup and kicked all the Jews out of Jerusalem, and they spread all over the world. And they developed different traditions. But it is true, it's a very long, so we usually date Abraham's stories to about 1800 BCE. So yes, 3,000, 4,000 even years of history. But only the extremists really embrace that as a mandate now. So, but nonetheless, you hear a lot about them.
Yeah.
Hamas has a similar idea. They believe, of course, that the Israelis are interlopers and they shouldn't have been granted land there in 1947. But also Hamas has responded with, we too have a religious mandate for Palestine, for the whole of Palestine, Roman name, of course, for that area. And they call it a waqfa. It's a meaning a religious grant from God. So you have competing claims that are so similar, really. And it's just astonishing to me that this has really come alive. So it was 1988 that they claimed Palestine as a religious grant. And of course, so everybody has competing narratives for which God is and which people deserve the land. And of course, all three too aren't all one way. I mean, they're complicated too.
Yeah, all three of the world's major religions lay claim to that region: Christianity, the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith. If you had to go back, though, is there one of the three that really supersedes the other in terms of being present in that land and really, making that their home?
Well, I wouldn't make any claim, but it is true the Muslims have been there for a long time, right? That's what the whole Crusades were about, trying to reclaim the land. And that's just, and of course, even when you had, just before Israel was established, you had the Ottoman Empire into, what was it, 1917 or something. They lost control of the land, but they were very much perceived, at least, as religiously oriented. So I suppose the Muslims have the most recent grant, but the Israelis, the extreme groups, would have claimed that they have this 4,000-year legacy, which is
Well, in more recent times, you just mentioned the Ottoman Empire ruled over the region from about the 16th to the 20th centuries. And then if you really look at the present-day conflict, there seems to be two events that set the stage for what we're dealing with today, both occurring in the 20th century. the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which asserted British control over Palestine, and then the UN partition plan in 1947, which established the State of Israel in 1948. Can you tell us a little bit about those more contemporary dynamics and how they have shaped the conflict that we view and are dealing with today?
So let's go back a little further to 1888. A guy named Theodor Herzl wrote a book called The Jewish State. This is a time when nations in Europe were very much inflamed by nationalism, and Jews were being subject to genocides, with all the pogroms. And he wrote a book saying, wouldn't it be nice if we had some place we could go where people wouldn't persecute us? He didn't say it had to be Israel, but nonetheless, his claim got taken up by a lot of religious people who started exporting Jews to settle in the land of Palestine. Of course, he himself was an atheist, and so were a lot of those early communities. They weren't religiously inflamed or driven, but nonetheless, they did bring with them a lot of rabbis who had different opinions about the land of Israel. For instance, it seems very significant to me that the Orthodox, who are this extreme group right now, a lot of the Orthodox Jews didn't believe in establishing a state of Israel. They believed that they weren't to establish Israel as a state until the Messiah comes, a descendant of David who will lead everybody back to the promised land. Then you'll have peace on earth and lion lying down with the lamb and all that lovely stuff. So they rejected this idea of a Jewish state in favor of a messianic redemption. Nonetheless, they're a huge population now in Israel. So it just seems so complicated. So 1917, yes, Britain controlled the land, and it issued the Balfour Declaration, recognizing the right of Jews to go to Palestine. And so they started settlements and things. Then, of course, in 1947, the UN issued its partition plan and divided up the country between Palestinians and Israelis. And then there's more, of course. There was a response to that, a warlike response. And another in 1967, I think, was the most crucial war. The Israelis got all this land. They were I'm sure, very zealous about their victories. And the Palestinians, of course, were not. So it's a very deep history.
So we've had two states living side by side really since the 1948 establishment of the Israeli state. There's been discussions and tentative agreements in some cases towards a two-state solution, discussion over a single-state solution, and we're now faced with the prospect of the Palestinians being at war with the Israelis and the destruction of their homeland and the migration potentially of Palestinians to other Middle Eastern states. But when you look back at how these historical claims have shaped the modern identities of both Israelis and Palestinians, what's the argument that each group makes at this point to laying claim to that area?
I don't think most Palestinians nor most Israelis, have seated their aspirations in a religious claim. Nonetheless, the political elements have these religious flags waving over them. And it does seem a shame, in my view, that the Oslo Peace Accords, what was that, 1993? They had the two-state solution, which was just blown away by subsequent conflicts, and I think, right now, if it would be very nice if this new plan that the Saudis and some of the others have come up with in response to Trump's idea to make Palestine into a resort, and they want to rebuild and reclaim, at least allow the reclamation of the land, but they would also insist on getting rid of the religious ideologies that motivated it. So they'll never go away. I mean, these claims are just too deep-seated. And after all this, since October 7th, there's been both sides are just so heated up since not just because of the people the abductees, but in response to the terrible bombing and destruction of Palestinian lands. I mean, it just looks awful there.
Yeah. So you mentioned Margot the current idea that's on the table to turn that region into more of a resort destination. I'd have to believe that given the religious origins of that region, that would just further inflame Middle Eastern perspectives about the West and the capitalist society that we export into other parts of the world, and just increase the backlash and probably in some cases, terrorist activities against the West as a revolt against commercialization of their religious lands.
I totally agree with you. So it seems to me significant that Hamas, Hamas won with 57% of the population voting for it in 20 years ago. I can't imagine that they're still quite so popular, but I bet this will further inflame terrorist aspirations. It's just so radical. And also, Hamas has been very clever. They have this Hebrew website where they take Israeli songs and they have dubbed them with their language, and they're full of warlike elements, and they insist, or Yassim insists that Israelis will be gone by 2027 based on this kind of screwy numerology idea. But wouldn't that be something? So I don't think it's going to go away. I mean, it might be muffled for a while, this aspiration to get rid of the Israelis, but I don't know. I can't imagine that some of the Israelis too are getting I'm sure that they too are inflamed by this conflict. It's obvious that they are.
Well, we never know what's going to happen in elections. We have such a divided country here, and in fact, a lot of similar divisions across the world over conservative versus liberal points of view. Many conservative views rooted in religious beliefs, even in this country, with the conservative Christian right driving a lot of the conservative agenda. But let's talk about things in terms of modern context. So you mentioned leaders like Netanyahu, Hamas's leadership. Give our listeners a sense of how that region has been governed, both in Israel and the government of Palestine, which is not necessarily viewed as representative of the people that live there.
Yes, I think so. People get very exercised by the fact that Hamas was voted democratically into government in the 80s, 87, I think. And then they just been there ever since. They never went home. But they did establish a kind of democratic party, but this was in competition with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Fatah movement. So they were criticized because they weren't religious enough by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So they took, Hamas is a complicated organization. They have different prongs, which different different sects, which advocate different things. So some of them were very secular, and Hamas, it's important to remember, they began as a charity organization. They were an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they went in there when Fatah and Yasser Arafat was failing as a leader, and they set up schools, and they put people in hospitals, and they established daycare, and they established youth groups, and they really seated themselves as a charity organization. This more radical arm, I think, is in response to this this pressure from Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups. But it's always important to know that they are strictly regional. They're not like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda used to want to set up a Islamic government over the whole world, right? And so did ISIS. But these are strictly regional. And they had they really established their manifesto in 1988, but it was in 2006 where they won 76 out of 132 seats in their change in the government, with their change and reform party. And then there weren't any more elections. And they rejected the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords, right? But they did adapt. They always stressed more of a nationalistic than a religious emphasis, except for a few folks. And a lot of this was embroiled by things like the first Intifada, but the second Intifada, when Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, this was an absolute no-no, because this is supposed to be sacred land. And this was just really aroused Palestinians. So what's happening now, the whole world seems to be paying more attention to this religious element, especially the Christian right in the United States. Very frightening, I think. And even then, January 6th, folks, you wouldn't know from watching the news, but when you look at organizational videos on this, you find out that the Christian nationalists were a huge component of the January 6th groups that protested Trump losing the election.
Yeah. Well, religion, has an impact on governments around the world. And, we have to think about the ethical contradictions that emerge when religious principles are applied to war and governance. So let's look at our own country. You could argue that separation of church and state are fundamental to our constitutional beliefs and to our way of life. Yet, if you look back at our own history, you could trace back the emergence of the evangelical right and the groups like the Moral Majority from days in the early 80s with Jerry Falwell, and the influence that they had over the Reagan administration and the movement of that religious belief towards deep-seated principles that the Republican Party, for example, has followed around anti-abortion, which has fueled a lot of their political movements, even up to today, obviously. So even in our country, where we believe to be separated from religious ideology, we have tremendous influences on our government over religious factions.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Something that's been surprising to me is this rising lost cause movement in the South. Bromley, in one of my books, he wrote a chapter on this, and it was really kind of surprising me. They take some of their motivation going back to the way that they were mistreated in the aftermath of the Civil War, and they were a boon to slaves because they educated them, they Christianized them, and they don't get any credit for it. And there's kind of a surprising inflamed ideology connected to that. And of course, more recently, as you said, since the Reagan administration, we have this moral majority. Even the Proud Boys, the leader of the Proud Boys, Enrico Tarrio, who just got out of jail, he's embraced a Christian perspective, but he uses it, of course, for his own Proud Boy ideologies too. But very much building on like kind of racial conflicts. I think it's very hot right now. But however, the scene seems to be changing every week. You have new elements that are just shocking, and you want to deal with them.
Yeah, but it's interesting though that you would expect countries like Israel and Palestine to be guided by some degree of religious nationalism. Religion is at the heart of their society, and in many cases their political apparatus. But it's not an expectation in this country, and that's why I think the times that we live in now are so interesting when we see these lines being blurred between church and state. So there's an expectation of that in some countries that are founded on religious principles, but not necessarily in some of the westernized countries that, really pride themselves on separating out religious considerations when it comes to governance.
Yeah, even Iran, you have more women in the universities than men, for one thing. And I think it's kind of inherently an intellectual region. It's likewise with, I don't know right now with Palestinians, but Palestinians were also very gung-ho on education. Of course, Israel is too, because it's basically a shadow of a Western society, even though the religious right gets all the attention. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I would hope that people would take classes like world religion.
Well, that's a good start, right? Shining a light on issues and education and understanding historical references is a good way to not repeat the mistakes of the past and to learn from them. But you've mentioned a couple times, pessimism over, is there a path forward? But if you had to envision some path towards de-escalation and conflict in that region, can you see a pathway in the near future? Or are we stuck in this cycle for an indefinite amount of time?
I'm hoping that in the next year, there'll be this movement that the Saudis launched to go in and take over Palestine, reconstruct it, make sure there are free and fair elections. And even though the Saudis are also religiously identified, but I would think that they could have power to kind of, de-Islamicize the conflict. And in Israel, there are some great voices that are against what's going on. And, so one of the chapters in this book I keep touting is on the ethics of war in Israeli history, or in the history of Israel. And it's really, if Netanyahu and the IDF would be educated in this, I think it would really shift things. I mean, maybe they are, but I don't know it. But you have explicit regulations about not destroying cities. And if you are going to go in to destroy a city that's being rebellious to you, you always have to leave one side open for escape, because otherwise people will fight to the death, right? Because they feel like they're going to die. And you have representations of the loss of, I don't know, morality and ethics among the military, who go in and perform inhuman acts such as destroying the whole Palestine. So it seems, and there's a long history of this going back 2,000 years, and it would seem just essential. People would get educated on some of these principles of just war, Israelis and Palestinians too, although, I've been reading the Quran lately, looking for principles of just war. And of course, there are similar principles. You never are supposed to destroy women and children or people who are identified as a religious. And you're always supposed to offer peace before you go into a city. This is in the Bible as well. You offer peace for 3 days. We're coming in, surrender or take the consequences, and then people can negotiate with you. I think in some ways, a return to some of these actual religious principles might humanize what's going on and, I don't know, depoliticize some of the fervor.
Yeah, or at least provide some, moral guidance in terms of, humane treatment, even during times of war. Yeah, throughout world history, atrocities have been committed, even up to current days in terms of world conflict. We see things happening today: genocide, gassing of populations, killing of women and children. Some of those tactics are at the heart of terrorist movements, because they embody, the intended outcome of those actions, which are to create fear and terror in populations. So, you mentioned, Dr. Kitts, being a student of history and learning from what's happened in the past so we don't repeat those mistakes. But, what lessons from history can help us address today's religious nationalism-driven conflicts?
I would say there might be an impulse to not go there, if people are starting to look at things that happened, like in World War II, for instance, or, in Turkey, and that was in 1917 when there was a great destruction of Christians. They're just, I don't know, people should just get educated and then just not want to go there, because it's just it stirs you up in your gut. You just can't, you just can't believe you're committing these atrocities. But I'm sure there's a lot of tit for tat in the ideology of the leaders, like they did it to us, so we're going to do it to them. And that's why I think having third parties come in and try to negotiate peace is a better idea, not by setting up a resort in Palestine.
Or what about even today's negotiations, which, don't have all parties necessarily represented equally? So, just as like what we're seeing happening with the Ukraine-Russian conflict, with the United States negotiating unilaterally on behalf of supposedly Ukraine with the Russian government and not having the Ukrainian government represented. I don't see how that results in a lasting peace. And that alone is a contemporary lesson in terms of how to address the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. I think that the conflict today doesn't seem to have an easy path forward, and I think that's probably obvious, but it doesn't seem like there is a reasonable path forward, because the whole idea of creating essentially a vacation destination in such a religiously focused area in and of itself seems like a really bad idea. But it doesn't seem like there is an alternative discussion happening right now.
I'm hoping in the next week we'll hear more from this group that's happening in Saudi Arabia, but different countries around the Persian Gulf who have all the money to go in and help. I'm just hoping. Also on the Ukraine thing, a lot of people don't realize that the Russian move to absorb Ukraine does have a religious undertone or overtone to it, because the Orthodox Christians under Patriarch Cyril feels that there must be this expansion back to the lands, going back to the czars. I mean, there is religious components there too. But the Ukrainians, I think, are generally not as religiously driven. So,
no, nor are the Russians in terms of a driving force to conquer lands and reassemble the Soviet Empire. It's not obviously a driver of that desire, with Russia not being rooted in deep-seated religious beliefs currently, although the country has a history of strong religious factions involved in their government and governance. So again, we see religious nationalism, in this case, in somewhat of a mask veil, driving a lot of this world conflict. So, is the end analysis here that regardless of what religion you believe in, that there is a lesson to the separation of church and state, and the reality that the governance of people, in a country should be not necessarily rooted in the religious beliefs of one faction of that country, which don't speak for the pluralistic society that probably exists in almost all countries today.
Yeah, or seeking common ground, because like every religion espouses the golden rule, do unto others that you would have them do unto you. Somehow that gets lost in this fervor of you did it to me, so I'm going to do it to you, and not the good doing. So yes, I do think education is key, but I also think, there should be just calmer minds in this. I don't know about, the Israelis should know better. I'm surprised that they haven't booted out Netanyahu, but I'm pretty sure they will, because they are more of a secular society, except in the military. Nonetheless, and the Palestinians too, I don't think of them as particularly a religiously driven group, except for that Hamas has taken over their mentality. Hamas is waving the flags over this conflict. I mean, you can pick and choose aspects of religions to, inflame your most deprived warrior drives, or to seek harmony with other people in the world. But I think you were right where you started out. A lot of this had to do with the influence of Western secular traditions in these areas where people just felt overrun, and they didn't feel that they had a voice anymore. So I think it's some kind of blend of some recognition of religion without pushing it as a national doctrines would be great.
Well, we could only hope that we could evolve to a point where we can separate out the reality that different people are going to have different religious beliefs, and that's okay. But aren't necessarily, it's not necessarily good to have those religious beliefs be the driver of the government of those countries and the governance that all of the people that live there, no matter what their beliefs, have to subscribe to. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we've explored a lot of the deep roots of religious nationalism and its impact on one of the most enduring conflicts of our time. Some of the key takeaways from our conversation include the Israeli-Palestinian conflict being deeply tied to historical and religious claims, and that religious nationalism intensifies political agendas and deepens those divisions, and that achieving a lasting peace is going to require navigating both political pragmatism and the deeply held religious convictions of the groups that inhabit those areas. That's a lot of complexity and a lot of diplomacy to navigate those dynamics. And, I hate to be a pessimist, but to some degree, I share your pessimistic view that there may not be an easy path forward here, at least not one that's visible today. So my guess is that you and I are going to be back talking about this conflict in the near future as things develop, and hopefully we'll have a couple of path forwards that we can discuss that might lead to a lasting peace in that region. Do you have any hope that is in the near future?
I think people will break. They just can't bear it anymore. I'm hoping people will stand up to the more fervent religious nationalist voices in their governments and say, no, we don't want this. Let's get back to the meat and potatoes issues.
We'll leave it with that hope dangling out there for all of us. So, I'd like to thank Dr. Margot Kitts for sharing her expertise, and thank our listeners for joining us. And if you're enjoying Hangin at the Reef, please remember to subscribe and leave a review. And remember to stay tuned to future episodes where we'll take on a variety of topics. And I'm sure we're going to be revisiting this topic in the near future as things develop in the Middle East. So thanks for your time today, Dr. Kitts.
Thank you. So nice to be here.
It's good to have you.